We have a very distinguished and experienced panel of experts. To my far right is Keith Richburg. 20 years ago, he was covering the handover for the Washington Post. He is currently the director of the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong. Next to him is Steve Vines, who covered Hong Kong and the handover for The Independent and is still quite a well-known TV presenter and columnist, as well as running his own business. And next to me is Dominic Ziegler. He covered Hong Kong for The Economist 20 years ago, and in an amazing feat of journalistic longevity, is still with The Economist. May I have a round of applause for that? Thank you for inspiring us, Dominic. I'm sure I will not be with the BBC in 20 years' time. Let me start just by asking you to describe the tone of your reporting 20 years ago. And by that, I don't mean I got the tone completely right. I mean, what were you focused on? What were the headlines? What were you writing about? Let me start with you, Keith.
Sure. Thank you, Juliana, and thank you everybody for coming out on braving a Thursday night to come out here and hear us reminisce. So I think it's a great event to come and talk about the handover. And by the way, there are quite a few others old friends here in the audience who were here in '97 as well. So when we do question and answers, I'm sure you'll be able to contribute as much or more than we can. And I guess I'm the sole American up here as well, so surrounded by the Brits. But BBC and two Brits.
No, the two of us. The two of us.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah, but you work for BBC, right? But for the American and working for an American newspaper, our look at the handover may have been a little bit different as well, because we were looking at it first of all through the lens of China, primarily, and what it was going to be like for Hong Kong. This kind of modern, sophisticated economy to be going back to this communist-ruled country that we didn't really know or understand very well. It's hard to realize now, but 1997 was actually not that far removed from Tiananmen Square. And so a lot of what we were covering was through the prism of China at Tiananmen Square time. When I went back and looked at my own coverage specifically, and I was trying to figure out, as the bureau chief here, I came in '95 to be here through the handover. And so what I decided to do was just kind of take a few whacks of a few bites of the apple leading up to the handover. So one week I just wrote about non-Chinese immigrants, the Indians, the Vietnamese, etc. The following month I would write about poverty in Hong Kong and how the Chinese might handle that. The following month I would write about the British civil servants, including British members of the police force, and what would happen to them after the handover. So I tried to take on little bites of the apple here, but I think overall, the tone of the coverage was trying to reflect what the tone was in Hong Kong at the time, which was, it's kind of a cliche, but I'll say cautious optimism. I didn't see a lot of pessimism at the time, or even a lot of fear. I saw a lot of people thinking, well, this one country, two systems formula, maybe it's really going to work. And I guess I was trying to reflect the schism here at the time. Obviously, there was a lot of debate over the LegCo and the formulation, the election scheme for how you were going to elect people, but that was kind of going on in the background. But overall, from the business community, from average people I talked to, from friends I had here, there was an attitude like, well, we're going to be an SAR. This is really going to work, so we're going to give this a try. And so that seemed to be at least what I tried to reflect in the coverage, and as I tried to take these sort of whacks at it, in the months leading up to the handover.
Thank you. Steve?
I'm very reticent to talk on behalf of the British media, but there are some consistent themes running through it. I know Dominic's paper is much more international and didn't cover it, but there was a confluence of events in 1997. New government in Britain under Tony Blair, literally weeks old. His first foreign policy outing was in Hong Kong. It was the height of speculation over the troubles of Prince Charles and the royal family. Prince Charles arrived in Hong Kong. It was also a major British nostalgic event. We'd ruled this place for 150 years. Good God, it was coming to an end. How could they possibly survive without us? So a lot of the British coverage, I have to say, was very inward-looking, very British-focused. And I remember one of the things that Tony Blair said when he was in Hong Kong, he said, one thing you can be very sure of, these aren't his exact words, but it's a correct paraphrase, and I remember writing it down, is we will never forget you. We will always be paying attention to Hong Kong. And the following day, of course, he'd forgotten Hong Kong. And this was one thing which I think was a problem with the British coverage. We were so busy talking about the British heritage, the things that had happened as a result of the British departure, that one of the really big things that we missed, I must say, some of us tried to cover it, but we had no interest from our editors in London, because it wasn't just me who tried to put this in the paper, was to talk more about what was going on in Hong Kong. Because, of course, by 1997, you had the beginnings of a very big political development. As Keith says, we weren't that far away from Tiananmen, which was, of course, was the catalyst which brought people out onto the streets, possibly 1 million people in a society then which consisted of something like 6 million. Think how big that was. And also, more fundamentally, it was this change of generation. Hong Kong had been so much an immigrant society, but by 1997, we were starting to see the majority of people who lived in Hong Kong had actually been born in Hong Kong, were much more vested in Hong Kong, and were not only forming political groups, but there was a host of civil society organizations, which of course have blossomed since then. Most of this, I have to say, was missed in the coverage, and it was a big failing.
Dominic, I see you brought something for us.
Well, I mean, I did, for better or for worse, bring the editorial that we wrote, that I penned, I think.
Shall I share? I think this will be
And in
interesting.
terms of what we got wrong, I mean, it's more about what I got wrong about China.
Right. So June 28th, 1997. This is this is the front page. This is the. It was the leader. Yeah. How Hong Kong can change China.
So in my defense, in our defense, because we exercise democratic centralism like the Communist Party. We all debate fiercely and then have to write what the editor tells us to write. I did lay out two possibilities: one, that China would come in with a mailed fist, or that, and this was our expectation, that by and large, Hong Kong would continue within parameters, but would continue to thrive as a civil society of the type that you, Steve, just described. But for me, I was also covering China, but from here, not allowed to live in China at the time because the Chinese government didn't let us set up a bureau. So we had to deal with the Neanderthals at Xinhua. You might remember them, Mr. He, who did his very, very best to prevent us actually to cover China from China.
I'm not sure if I condone that term, but please go on.
We all knew when he didn't like what we wrote, because we would get a letter from a supposed Hong Kong citizen called Ben He. And whenever Ben He wrote in, we knew it was the guy from Xinhua. So anyway, yes, I mean, not long after Tiananmen, when journalists went into China, there tend to be fairly sort of seedy state security goons following us. And that made me admire Hong Kong's vibrancy and decency all the more. And then when I looked at British attitudes, I got more and more angry with my own country. There was a kind of condescension on the part of the British authorities towards Hong Kong elite. Now, I mean, some people deservedly were being described as toadies, but many, many Hong Kongers were trying this extraordinarily difficult task of switching allegiances in order best to protect the place you live in. And I think my sort of anger and fury sort of boiled over on the night of the handover, because you had on the one hand a very unpleasant Communist Party triumphalism, and at the same time you had both British smugness on the part of those who had officiated over Hong Kong for years, and amongst many Brits who came, a sense of an excuse for a great party. So anyway, they were sort of more my feelings at the time, and probably they were far too subjective for a journalist.
How reflective, this is a question for all of you, how reflective was this headline, the feeling that Hong Kong, with its institutions, with its freedom of speech, freedom of press, how much that was going to affect China?
Yeah, it's something that I wrote about probably a bit too much, and I went back in preparation for this and looked at my Handover coverage, and I think my conclusion was pretty much that Hong Kong was going to change China more than China was going to change Hong Kong. The word at the time that everybody was using was convergence. That Hong Kong that China was changing so rapidly in the 90s, and I was like the others, I was going in and out of China from Hong Kong, and we were seeing these dramatic changes happening in China. And the idea was that the political system and the economic system in China was changing so rapidly that the political system was bound to at some point catch up with it. And then surely 20 years at the time seemed like a long time away. And we all thought that in 20 years, China was not going to be an authoritarian communist-run state with a Marxist-Leninist party in control. Surely it was going to be a lot more democratic, because that was what we all learned in political science classes, right? The more economies develop and the middle class expands, the more they start demanding democratic rights, right? I remember in the 90s going in and covering stories about village elections in China and how this was going to be the stepping stone to eventual change in China. And we all talked about, I wrote about the Singapore model. Was that going to be how China was going to emerge? Was it going to be the Hungarian model where the Communist Party would allow competition? So all of us were more kind of, at least myself, I'll only speak for myself, I was more speculating on how China was going to be changed in 20 years, and it would look more like Hong Kong, and Hong Kong would be the thing that kind of gave China the model for how you can still run this modern economy, and still kind of keep power within the hands of the Communist Party. And I admit that was kind of a failing of mine at the time, thinking that China was changing rapidly.
I mean, I know what Keith is talking about. This was an era of immense optimism. Remember, it was still the era of Deng Xiaoping. We still thought that remember the open door? Gosh, there's a door that's managed to swing back closed again. But I have to say one thing for the Independent, and I'm not going to blast the Independent, which of course has much reduced since those days. But we were actually very skeptical about that particular point of view. I personally was skeptical about it because I remember being sent by the then foreign editor. He said, everybody tells us that Shenzhen is really what China is going to become, and it's going to become that because it's so close to Hong Kong, and it's going to be the great model for the rest of China. So I dutifully went across the border without Mr. He's approval, which, as Dominic has pointed out, was quite difficult to obtain. And I spent, not that long, but I spent some time in Shenzhen. And I remember thinking, God help us. Is this really what the future is? I mean, we're talking about 20 years ago in Shenzhen. I mean, you look at Shenzhen now, this gleaming city. Shenzhen 20 years ago was indeed a big, expanding city. There was a lot of industry. But there weren't things like pavements. The municipal infrastructure petered out. You'd go along a road, and then suddenly, particularly if you went along it at night, it was pitch dark. And I remember thinking, gosh, they're really developing this place at an enormous speed, but they're not paying any attention to the people who live there. As long as the people come there to work, and of course a lot of people were coming to work and they were earning a lot more than they would have back in their villages, but it was a dump. It was an enormous dump. And because it was an enormous dump, it had an enormous impression on me, and I remember it very heavily clouded everything I wrote after that about how much Hong Kong would influence the rest of China. Having said that, I do think the general party line, if we may describe it as that, is much as Keith described. I mean, there was this idea of a reforming communist party. Well, as we heard from Ching Chong, who's there, yesterday, one of the things that the reforming Communist Party is doing nowadays is having this sort of subterranean cultural revolution 20 years after these events. So how much reform did take place?
I mean, I think you're right, Steve, that the debate about whether China could liberalize politically was very alive in China itself, and you would sometimes speak to sort of middle-ranking officials who would say, look, just wait for this current generation of top leaders to move on, and you'll see that things are different. Now, we got that absolutely wrong, partly because of projecting our hopes onto China, partly because it was that unique unipolar moment when there was an American-led order that sort of believed in political liberalism. But in terms of how it affects Hong Kong now, I mean, I think one thing that worries me about the relationship between Hong Kong and China is just the size of Hong Kong's economy in relative terms. At the time of the handover, Hong Kong's GDP was equivalent to 18.4% of China's, and now it's less than 3%. In '97, China's economy was 5 times bigger than Hong Kong's. Now it's 35 times. So the challenge is going to be how does Hong Kong not become just another city in China?
FCC. So, I'm sure you've all been reflecting back ahead of meeting us all here today. Knowing what you know now, what stories do you think you should have done but didn't do at the time?
Thanks. Well, first of all, I missed the big story of the summer of 1997, which was not the Hong Kong handover. It happened about a month later when the Thai baht collapsed, and it started the Asian economic crisis. And the ripple effects of that we're still seeing. It started the fall of Suharto, the breakaway of East Timor. It got Anwar Ibrahim kicked out as finance minister in Malaysia when they went to currency controls. It started the People's Constitution in Thailand. That then got Thaksin elected. That started the ripple effects. So we're still seeing the ripple effects of the Asian economic crisis, which was not looking at and did not anticipate because I was so focused on, oh my God, are the PLA troops going to come marching into Hong Kong? I woke up the day after the handover and went out to get a taxi to go have lunch at the Mandarin Oriental, and everything was kind of the same. Nothing had really changed. And I'm not quite sure what I was expecting, but somehow I thought there was going to be some dramatic difference the next day, and it never really happened. So I guess in terms of tone, I was thinking really that there was going to be some dramatic change in the handover, not really recognizing that. And I have seen changes in 20 years, which we can, having come back here now, which we can talk about later. But, for some reason, I thought those changes might come immediately, and in fact, nothing really changed. Hong Kong 2 months after the handover was pretty much like Hong Kong 2 months before the handover, with the exception of bird flu or some other things, because the handover was kind of a thing that had happened. The change had really started occurring well before '97, when there were locals in charge of pretty much everything going on. I think the other thing that I didn't do well enough or cover well enough is working for an American publication. I bought pretty much hook, line, and sinker. When the U.S. Congress, I was really the most popular person by all these U.S. congressional delegations coming out to Hong Kong and promising, we are going to keep monitoring the situation in Hong Kong. And they reminded us that the handover agreement was an international treaty that was going to be monitored by the United States. And I really did think that maybe the U.S. would have some role to make sure that China, maintained its commitments over Hong Kong. And pretty much there was really nothing that was going to be done after the handover as well. So I maybe put too much emphasis on that as well, too much emphasis on looking at the Washington connection to this.
Those hearings, to some extent, have restarted. But anyway, to some extent, yeah, exactly. Oh, well, we'll get to that. Oh.
Well, Dominic says Britain's forgotten Hong Kong. There are those 6th monthly reports which have enormous influence and are reported by, oh, that's right, no one. Anyway, but
I did one report.
Did you?
The
Well
serious
done.
breach, yes.
Yeah, well done.
In response to the missing books, so there was one, one time.
Okay. gosh. I'm
20
not
years, probably.
I'm not a journalism is a first draft of history guy. So when you look at, what we missed, I think, journalists miss a lot. So I'm not, you respond to what you think your readers will want to hear about. To be honest with you, British readers wanted to hear about British stuff. They didn't want a lot of Chinese stuff. So I'm not ashamed of the fact that the coverage did focus on what our readers wanted to read. Whether that gave them a correct impression of what was happening, I honestly don't think it did. But the one thing, if we are going to talk about regrets, that I really, really regret, is there was a window, and that window probably closed within 5 years, when you could speak to people from the leftist camp, you could speak to people from even Chinese officials were quite chatty, even people, God help us, in Xinhua, well, when it was still Xinhua before it became the controlling liaison office down in Western, there was that great opportunity which I feel we should have exploited more. I remember speaking to a rather tall fellow called Siwai Leung for hours. Can you believe that such a thing would happen today? So I feel, what's actually happened in terms of communication between the overseas media and the people who actually take the decisions here is that practically all of that has been shut off. There was a much bigger opportunity then to speak to those people. Doesn't exist today, or maybe I'm wrong.
You're right.
My experience is that it's very, very difficult. And of course, I loved speaking, and this is now my favorite topic. I loved speaking to the turncoats, the Rita Fan, member of the British Empire, asking her where she'd put her medal, and she goes, "Oh, I don't talk about that." I have to say, that was sheer malice, but it was very enjoyable.
Well, I've only just recently moved back to Hong Kong, so I'm disappointed, Steve, to hear that it's harder to get to speak to these people, because what I loved about reporting from Hong Kong 20 years ago was that you had all the intimacy of a small city government and sort of people, involved with business and the economy, and that you could go from top to bottom in a day, and at the same time, as thinking about small city affairs, which include tons of gossip, you're also dealing with very big and very important issues to do with a territory returning to a huge authoritarian power. And if it isn't possible now to get that sense, well then, my job would be a little diminished as a consequence. I'm sorry to hear that.
Let me follow up just by asking about the situation that we face now, as many of us look ahead to our coverage of the upcoming anniversary of the 1st of July. So we now have very divisive politics in Hong Kong, a small, very small but very vocal independence movement, and a Chinese leadership that seems in many ways less liberal than it was 20 years ago. Was any of this, did you think about any of this? Was any of this, did any of this even seem possible 20 years ago?
Yeah, that's an excellent, excellent question. I guess looking at where the situation is now and things that I thought at the time, there are a lot of myths that have been shattered over the last 20 years. The first one is that China would never do anything to touch Hong Kong or rock the boat in Hong Kong because we all heard the cliche, they wouldn't kill the goose that laid the golden egg, it was said. Although Chris Patton, who was here at the time, I remember him telling us, I think you were there in a meeting with him, Steve, where he said, history is littered with the carcasses of decapitated geese. So so it has happened in the past. The other myth that was, that was one myth that was shattered. The other myth that was shattered was the idea that Hong Kong people don't care about politics. And I heard that over and over again. And Hong Kong people only care about making money. And I think Occupy and the election of these young localists to the LegCo kind of disproved the theory that people here don't care about politics. I think people do care about
But did
politics.
that seem true 20 years ago?
No, it did not seem true 20 years ago. It seemed accurate 20 years ago to say people don't really care about
So
let's
there
go in
weren't the
politics.
weekly family Sunday protests and...
Yeah, they were pretty small by comparison. I mean, the Tiananmen protests got people out, but that was pretty much it. I mean, the turnout at LegCo elections, were actually relatively small then. They couldn't even, the pan-democracy camp couldn't even field candidates in most of the constituencies at the time, and they would target the constituencies. So, the idea that this was not a real political city, I think was something that was kind of shattered. It became more political, I think, because of the actions of China at the time. So that was one of the myths that was shattered, perhaps because of what happened afterwards, the Chinese actions. There were a lot of things we wrote about at the time, that I actually bought into. I also bought into the idea that, in 20 years' time, Shanghai would become as important a city as Hong Kong in the international arena, that it would become, that the renminbi would be floating freely and traded freely, and that Shanghai would be the place that we should all be paying attention to. That was another one of those kind of myths, I guess, that was shattered. And I guess, and it's hard to believe now, I mean, because, I like Dominic, I left and came back. I just came back full-time about a year ago. People say, what's the big difference? I mean, 20 years ago when I was here, or in the 90s, I don't think I ever remembered, other than the liaison officer, Xinhua it was called, I don't remember meeting that many people from the mainland in Hong Kong. I don't remember hearing, Putonghua or Mandarin spoken. And now, because of various reasons, they just, because they changed the quota of tourists who are allowed to visit after SARS and other reasons. I'm at HKU now, where it seems like half the student body now is from the mainland. It seems like it's becoming, or the mainlandization of Hong Kong is something that I never anticipated, and that's been going on to a great degree now. It's hard to sit in any restaurant and not hear Mandarin being spoken around you now. So that's brand new, and that's something that I didn't anticipate, that I wish I had thought about more, that it would become more of a mainland city.
I wonder if, I slightly disagree with Keith about this, because I think that there was more politics going on than most of us reported. But I think fundamentally this idea that Hong Kong has suddenly had deep political divisions, good God. Hong Kong suddenly had deep political divisions? Do people forget the bitter, violent divisions between the communists and the Kuomintang who are in Hong Kong? Now, it's quite true. The KMT forces have more or less been eliminated in Hong Kong, but these were very real and bitter divisions. And they were brought from the mainland into Hong Kong by the immigrants who came here. And of course, we forget, people say, oh my God, there was violence in the Occupy movement. People were throwing water around. And we're also happen to be celebrating or commemorating the 50th anniversary of the 67th riots, when people were killed on the streets. Actually, the level of political confrontation is actually less today than it was in 67. And again, I refer to the very interesting lunch that was at the FCC on yesterday. I mean, it was worth remembering that at that time, it wasn't just the core of the Communist Party who were causing all this trouble. There were a lot of people in Hong Kong who were sympathetic because of the very dire circumstances of the Hong Kong working class back in the 1960s. Now, fast forwarding to the period which we're talking about, the period of the handover, one of the things which I've now more and more been reading about is the extent to which there were maybe not directly political movements, maybe not in the sense of political parties, because so many people in Hong Kong are afraid of political parties because of the association that has with the Communist Party. But there were enormous organizations in public housing. I remember talking to somebody who was collecting money for a campaign which was around provision of education facilities, and I said, well, how do you fund that? He said, we just put out a table wherever we go, places in the new territories, and we get funded instantly. So many people were prepared to take part in that kind of, if you like, not very high profile, but very real political activity. The difference is that it was perhaps conducted at a more subterranean level. In other words, it wasn't adequately reported, certainly not in the international media, but it was there. So that when you had, and this I still think is the seminal moment, and why wouldn't it have been, the Tiananmen Square massacre, and you had all these people coming out in the streets, there was no looking back after that. It's true that we now have a generation of younger people who are involved in protest movements who weren't even born then. But many of them were very influenced by their parents who came out in the streets in 1989. The protests that began there have, of course, continued on an annual basis ever since, with varying degrees of strength. But it's the people who are involved in that who you see all the time as being part of the core of Hong Kong's political society, actually on both sides of the fence, because it also forced, and this is the other interesting thing in my mind, it also forced the pro-government side of the equation to get themselves organized. Just remember that back then, the Communist Party still, as it is today, operates in a clandestine way. It appears in drag as the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong. But, you know, if you ask them, are you members of the Communist Party, they go. So it forced also the leftists to get organized and to form these various, not just the DAB, but the trade unions, all of which existed, but they got a lot more organized, a lot more busy actually mobilizing people. So, you know, no politics around about then, I'm not so sure.
And, I mean, the civic activism certainly struck me in the 90s deeply, and it was clearly a training ground for politicians. But maybe the way to think about it is that, you know, Hong Kong is an overtly political city when it needs to be. That was the case in '89. It was the case around the time of the handover and the huge fight over the legitimate LegCo. It was the case in 2003 in Article 23. And that's not going to change. And in fact, I think the sort of ideological conflict can only grow larger. And I really don't think Hong Kong today is an apolitical city. Yes, things are quiet now. There might be sort of protest fatigue post-Occupy. But there sure as hell will come a moment when Hong Kong's values clash once more with Beijing's. So that will continue. Can I talk about things that I think? Can I mention a couple of things that I think haven't changed? And that's the general political balance since '97. Sort of 3/5 being kind of Democrat and 2/5 being pro Beijing or pro establishment, however you want to call it. One thing that I didn't anticipate, maybe 3 years after the handover, when I admired Beijing's relative tact, its relative hands-off stance, would be the growth of the mainland presence through the liaison office. And that, coming back now, that really has shocked me, because it's quite clear that through the liaison office, Beijing's activities now run deep, not just in politics, but in society. And I guess that's my chief worry, is, you know, Saiwan's control of Zhongwan.
Well, look, it's time for all of you who know so much about the subject, many of you who were here 20 years ago, to be lobbing questions at our panelists. Can we circulate some microphones? Can I ask that some microphones be circulated, please? You can have mine. And if you could introduce yourself.
My name is Jun Chen. I'm a journalist for Forbes.
And formerly the Economist Taiwan correspondent.
Yeah, but I wasn't here 20 years ago. I remember there was a famous headline about the death of Hong Kong. And I also remember a book by Steve about, Hong Kong, China's new colonies. It is still true. I mean, we still become true we still have 12, 30 years to go.
Well, I did write a book called Hong Kong, China's New Colony, which I'm amazed to say turned out to be quite prescient, because what is so interesting to me is how the Chinese Communist Party looked at the colonial structure and said, you know, we really like that. It's a great mechanism for us to control Hong Kong. A legislature without any powers, an executive council that's not elected, a civil service which is ubiquitous and does things which civil services in other parts of the world don't do. So, you know, we have to thank British imperialism, as I do every day, for the model it provided for the new Hong Kong. And what they want to do is preserve this in aspect. So they want all the things that were perfect for imperial control to be maintained in a modern society with highly educated people who've traveled around the world and are somehow prepared to say, you know what? I really like the way India was organized in 1920. We need much more of that in Hong Kong.
Anyone else would like to take a stab?
I don't disagree with any of that. No, I would just add that to me, as looking at it as an American, one of the great ironies, or the great hypocrisies, or whatever, was to see the British government at the time complaining so much about the loss of democracy in Hong Kong, and thinking that, well, you had 150 years to introduce democracy into this place. You had a long time you could have given passports to everybody who was born in Hong Kong at the time. So it was a bit. I don't know what the correct word is, but I always found it a bit strange that, in the last sort of several years that I was here before the handover, there was this great hue and cry about the loss of democracy in Hong Kong, and I was thinking, well, yeah, but it was a British colony. So, yeah.
Hi, Francis Moriarty. I'm a freelance, but over most of that period, I was working as an unusual position, being a foreigner working for a local news media. So I had a very different point of view on daily activities and what was happening. And I think the question Jean asked flows directly to my observation. I think all of us in the course of our reporting somewhere mentioned that the basic law, which was going to be the so-called mini-constitution for Hong Kong, had been written in Beijing with some participation by Hong Kong people, but it never was given for a referendum. There was no chance for the Hong Kong people to express their will or their thoughts about this document. Fine, but I think we all mentioned that someplace in our reporting. What we then didn't go on to do, and I think we're at fault because there's a world of literature that we all could have looked at, was to ask the question, what is likely to happen if people who have been colonized are not given a period of decolonization and an opportunity to discover their own identity, express their identity, etc. We didn't look at the implications of that. And that's what I think we're reporting on today, is the implications of the fact that the place went from decolonization to recolonization, as Steve has pointed out, and that the people have never had the opportunity that other colonies have had to go through a period of self-expression, dynamic native language, all that sort of things, which have been suppressed here, but you sooner or later have to deal with. And I think, A, that's the story we're dealing with now, and B, that's the story that we could have done then, but missed it. And in part, I think we, to balance it out, we did have not only the Thai baht fall, but we had the avian flu, and then we had SARS, and we had these major stories that everybody covered, which were feeding into this other thing. But we were too busy covering the fact than having the time to cover the implication. So I think what I'm saying is we missed that one thing. What happens to people when they don't have a chance after decolonization to run themselves?
I mean,
Well, I think Francis has a very good point. I certainly didn't write any stories in that vein. I wasn't thinking about decolonization in that sense. But China sure as hell was. And it still is. And it thinks the problem was sort of, you know, that not enough of the British vestiges have been got rid of, and that that's really what's needed to turn, you know, these recalcitrant Hong Kongers into proper patriots. But they've got that completely wrong. I don't think that Beijing understands Hong Kong people's sense of their own identity. And I don't think that what I imagine to be China's kind of chief long-term aim to change this is going to work, which is slowly integrating the Hong Kong economy into China's through the Greater Bay Area scheme. It's not going to work. So the problem is Beijing is going to continue to have this problem. I don't think Hong Kong is going to change. There's no way that political patriotism, love of country as the Communist Party defines it, is ever going to take place in Hong Kong. So in that sense, it's China that's got to change, since Hong Kong won't.
so you don't think resigned acceptance is something that you would get in Hong Kong?
I don't think we've seen very much of that. I mean, the Occupy protests don't speak of resigned acceptance, and yes, I mean, things are fairly quiet now, but one could imagine a whole range of...
But you've got this massive bridge being built from Macau, you've got plans for trains to be, you know, coming direct into Hong Kong, immigration possibly
yeah.
on Hong Kong. So, I mean,
The same logic is being
Lantau
applied by...
becoming...
China's applying the same logic to Taiwan as well, and it's not working there either. Economic integration to change people's attitudes is not working. In fact, it's precisely the young generation in Hong Kong, the generation that only knows Chinese sovereignty, that is the problem generation so far as Beijing is concerned.
Anyone else?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, I think Francis makes an excellent point there that this decolonization, for Hong Kong people, the decolonization process, as you would call it, never happened. I mean, I was in Africa and covered countries that went through this process. But for China, and again, I had the advantage of living in Hong Kong in the 90s, but also going in and out of Beijing and Shanghai and covering China from Hong Kong a lot. And for the Chinese, I was actually surprised that, you know, a lot of my mainland friends felt sorry for Hong Kong because they said, oh, you guys, they've been a colony for so long. To them, the return to China was the decolonization process. They were returning to the motherland. They were decolonizing. They were getting rid of this yoke of these Westerners who were telling them what to do. But literally, I kid you not, they actually felt sorry for people in Hong Kong, even though they knew it was a more modern and richer, sophisticated society because they were under the British. They weren't free. And so for them, in China, a lot of mainlanders felt that. And to me, the most shocking thing of all the things that I found that have been different since I returned to Hong Kong a year or so ago, the most shocking thing was, you know, you go to a football match here and there are Hong Kongers shouting, "We are not China, we are Hong Kong." And to me, that's like, wow, you know, because during the handover time, I remember in the 90s, you know, even people who were, you know, not on the pro-democracy side were still saying, "We are Chinese." But now to hear people, you know, young people especially chanting, "We are not China, we are Hong Kong," that's different to me.
You've no idea how many football stories on that I've had to file on.
No, you first. Oh, I'm Vivian McGrath. I was a foreign correspondent for Channel 7 back in the 90s. Francis, I don't think we asked that question because we were so arrogantly thinking that Hong Kong was going to change China. And I'm the same. I was a correspondent back in the 90s, and I've now come back 2.5 years ago, having been in the UK and Shanghai after that. And the thing that has really struck me about coming back is, A, hearing Mandarin everywhere, which I now speak, so I can now talk to people. But secondly, when I walked around Occupy Central, I was so amazed that there were these kids who were not born, or they were like 2 years old during the handover, and how fiercely proud they were to be Hong Kong Chinese, and that this identity that they felt so strongly for, because back when I was there, I was the same. I was a bit arrogantly thinking, all the Hong Kong Chinese think about is money. That's all they care about. They worship money, or if they're wealthy, then they become David Tang and go to royal, tea parties. So for me, that was the most interesting thing about this fierce identity and how political the young people have become, even though they do not remember the handover and they do not remember what we all experienced, which was Tiananmen Square.
Can I just say something on this? And this follows both from what you're saying and what Keith just said. There was an enormous swell of goodwill, patriotic feeling in China. I remember one thing that really sticks in my mind was going on the night of the handover up to the border when the PLA troops were coming in, and people standing in the pouring rain, clapping the PLA coming in. Nowadays, you have to mobilize those people to go there. You have to pay them. You have to give them meal tickets to turn up. Nobody was paid there. They've actually, to put it bluntly, pissed away an enormous swell of patriotic pride. Remember, the organization that organizes the annual commemoration for Tiananmen Square is called the Patriotic and Democratic blah, blah, blah movement. So, there is including among the Democrats, maybe primarily among the Democrats, there is this great pride in being Chinese. What the Chinese Communist Party has managed to do in the space of 20 years has made people cynical about the country, have made them less spontaneously proud of the country. I still think, what do I know? But I still have the impression that most people are patriotic. But they're smart. They know the difference between being patriotic and supporting the one-party state.
Actually, I was going to say one thing, which was, just that, which kind of contradicts everything that's just been said. There was this brilliant reporter here before, and then she worked for the ICAC, Stacey Moshe, remember? And because she, like some of us, and in fact it was not unusual to be a foreign reporter for local media in the 80s and 90s, it was quite common. And I did it too. But, and those of us who were already covering stuff from the early 80s, so when the talks first started about what was going to happen in 97 and after, it was very clear already then that there was a very strong Hong Kong point of view. There were groups then called the Hong Kong Observers, remember, who produced people who are now either in LegCo or ExCo or elsewhere in the government, who were demanding a say for Hong Kong people. They wanted to be part of the negotiations over what would be the future and part of the discussions about the basic law. This was serious stuff. I mean, I spent a lot of newsprint on the local papers in the early 80s covering that stuff. And of course, I don't know if she's here tonight, we had Emily Lau's marvelous question to Maggie Thatcher, about how did she feel about handing over 7 million Chinese to communists. So, it was actually clear, and it was all very obvious to anyone who had been here earlier that, and in fact, a lot of the Hong Kong people who had been worked up about it from when the talks began, which actually goes back to 79 when MacLehose first went to have a chat with Deng Xiaoping. And then a lot of those people left. I mean, there was this huge brain drain through the mid and late 80s. It was the people who were still here, and then 89 happened. And again, I mean, you're right, Steve, this whole thing about apolitical Hong Kongers is complete, what's the polite word? Nonsense. So that was one thing. But to get back to Stacey Moshe, what she described, and I always felt that because I think it's part of what created our naivety about what was going to happen, was that this period from the kind of mid-80s to the mid-90s, Stacey called it this golden era when Hong Kong really felt that it was no longer a British colony. I mean, London was a very long way away, and they certainly weren't listening to people in Hong Kong. I mean, it was a fairly hands-off kind of as far as colonies go. You think about other colonies. This was pretty hands-off. So it was no longer a British colony, and it was not yet an SAR. And it created this era, and that is when these people, these Hong Kong people, were having kids who later came along and did Occupy. And I don't think that's incidental. So there was a particular feeling. I mean, as foreign correspondents, and I know this, you know, when we've popped into other countries, that, you know, we miss all that because, of course, we're not part of the local community, and we don't, unless we happen to know the right people, we don't have that sense of stuff going on earlier. But, of course, you can look at newspapers in the 1930s in Hong Kong, and you can hear people talking about Hong Kong identity, which is not mainland. So, you know, it's about a different kind of perspective. But, of course, when everybody barges in for a certain ceremonial news moment, which is 97, then, you know, we know how the business works. And as you say, you give your audience what they need. But it is a ceremonial moment, and it's a very simple, single snapshot of something that is much more complicated. And that's why I also have to contradict Keith, because although the British didn't give the vote, they actually gave generations of liberal education. And you may find that turns out to be more revolutionary.
Hans Vriends, former foreign correspondent. Great to be back. Can you hear me? Closer. Oh, sorry. Hans Vriends, former foreign correspondent. I was actually busy covering the Thai baht. I'd like to ask, so besides looking back 20 years, how do you think the next... Besides looking back 20 years, how do you think the next 20 years could evolve for Hong Kong, especially the Hong Kong identity?
Yes, let's see. We'll ask you again in 20 years when you get this one.
Well, I thought the one thing I learned from 1997 was not to make any predictions about the next 20 years. But I mean, I think, but if I have to, I mean, it's got to be to do with China, has it not? And I think the one thing we now as journalists have to be careful about is not to extrapolate what appears to be sort of, you know, exponential economic growth and, you know, a rise in China's prestige as being, you know, inevitable. It certainly won't be. Growth is anyway already slowing. And I do think that China, in terms of its prosperity, is getting to the stage where what we predicted would happen 20 years ago may still happen. And I don't think that Xi Jinping's China dream speaks of confidence. I don't think the One Belt, One Road party up in Beijing last Sunday speaks of confidence. There's all sorts of kind of contradictions in what the One Belt, One Road scheme is designed to secure. My worry, so I think that there's likely to be a far less secure China than most people think in the coming years. And my worry, and actually I asked Ching Chung before we started what his view was this, will Hong Kong suffer more under a powerful, arrogant, comfortable, you know, a China whose leaders are comfortable in their power, or would it suffer more from a Chinese leadership that feels deeply insecure? And I would have thought the latter.
I would argue we're seeing some of that in Hong Kong now. But anyway.
Never ask a journalist what's going to, as you know, Hans, what's going to happen in 20 years, let alone next week. But all I think is that you can say, and this is why I wholly agree with Dominic, is, you know, Hong Kong now's fate is obviously dependent on what happens in China. So you have to ask yourself, what other dictatorship do you know in history that has lasted as long as the Chinese Communist Party? This was a dictatorship formed in 1949. Do we seriously believe, I don't know the answer, but I'm just asking from the point of view of history, do we seriously believe that dictatorship will last for 70 years, 80 years? There's no record in history of that ever happening. You remember how long the 1,000-Year Reich lasted? Not quite that period of time. You remember how long the Soviet Union lasted? Not quite that period of time. So, if you take a historic point of view of these things, and don't ask me where the break will come, but my view is that they are on the wrong side of history. So if they're on the wrong side of history, and this is because I'm so committed to being in Hong Kong, this is actually what worries me as well as fascinates me. I actually think that if something terrible happens in China, or you may say something wonderful happens in China, the vulnerable parts will be the bits around the periphery. Hong Kong is a bit around the periphery, and that's my greatest fear.
Yeah, as for predictions, I said that the UK would never go for Brexit, and Hillary Clinton would be the current president of the United States. So my predictions are all normally wrong, but I would agree that it has to be. We have to look at, in the next 20 years, we have to be looking at 20 years on China, not on Hong Kong. I don't see China loosening its grip on Hong Kong. I don't see China allowing universal suffrage of any meaningful sort. But looking at China. I remember when Jiang Zemin was there and Hu Jintao came in afterwards, and everybody said, well, Hu Jintao is going to be the real reformer. And then after his first term, nothing happens. Well, he's got to consolidate his power. So wait till the second term. Then Hu Jintao was really going to be the guy to open up. And then I was there. I was covering China during the ending years of Hu Jintao, and people couldn't wait to see the backside of him because Xi Jinping was a real modern guy. He'd lived in Iowa. He was younger. He was a princeling. He was more sure of his power. Wait till he got, and Li Keqiang, he was basically a Tiananmen protester, right? And wait till they get in power, right? Then they would say, oh, well, wait till the second term. Then that's when they consolidate their power. Then they'll be able to do things. So we just keep hoping against hope, I guess it is, that one day you're going to get this new generation of leaders in China who will change things. I mean, I agree that's never historically happened that you've seen a dictatorship last this long, but on the other hand, I think one thing about the Communist Party in China is it's proven that it's adaptable. It changes. It's basically there's nothing communist about the Communist Party in China anymore except the name. They've adopted market principles and everything else with state-owned enterprises. They're creating, I think, a new model of an economic model of state-controlled enterprises that can exist within the system. So we don't know if that's going to be a new model that's going to challenge the Western model. We've always had this assumption that people have to become like us at some point. If we let them in the WTO and trade with them and let in McDonald's, like in Cuba, eventually they're going to become like us. But I'm not 100% sure that China is not creating a new model that could persist for a very long time. And that means that China Hong Kong, is going to be the same under the thumb of that, China for a very long time to come. So I don't really necessarily want to predict anything. As I said, I'm not good at predicting, but I wouldn't predict anything changing.
Thank you. Last question. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Britt Clennett. I work for Reuters. I don't really remember the handover. I was 9 years old. I remember my parents having a party and everyone was drunk. But obviously in the last 20 years, I have seen, heard more Putonghua, and I would like to hone in on that point about Mainlandization, because I think it is a rather sensitive thing to report on. I'd like to get your advice on how you think to go forward without creating more hostility, because I do think that mainlanders here do feel targeted, and maybe perhaps discriminated against. And I know from living in Beijing and having friends in Beijing, they have been put off by coming here on a holiday. And so I think I'd like to get your view on how best to go forward with that, as reporters.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I took off my journalist hat after 30 years with the Washington Post and put on my teacher's hat. So I'm teaching at HKU now. Half my journalism students are from the mainland, and they've come to me, and some of them have come to me and told me that they feel uncomfortable going around Hong Kong speaking Mandarin. They say if they go into a shop and speak Mandarin, they sense hostility from the shopkeepers, or shopkeepers turn away from them, because they say it's easier to speak English than it is to speak Putonghua. And they've told me some of this, but I think this mainlandization is going on. I said something to some friends privately, a little confidentially, a couple of days ago, which was a little bit controversial, but I'll say it here to this group because I love you all. I said, look, what did they do? What did China do in Xinjiang? What did they do in Tibet? They moved in a bunch of Han Chinese so that Xinjiang is less than 50%, Uyghurs now. Tibet is probably, more majority Han Chinese now because it's been a state policy to just move people in, right? And I can see the same thing happening in China. Now, it started for good reasons. Tourism stopped here because of SARS and bird flu and other things, so they opened up the tourism border and let people in. And now people in Hong Kong complain if there are not enough mainland shoppers coming in to shop. They complain about the mainlanders being too many of them here, but then if they don't come during Golden Week and shop, they complain, where are the mainlanders, right? But I can see a point. Look at HKU. Look how many mainland students are coming in. Look at how many mainlanders are sending their kids here to go to high school, so they can then get into better universities in Hong Kong. So I can see a point where this mainlandization, which happened in Xinjiang, which happened in Tibet, could also be happening in Hong Kong, where you come back in 20 or 30 years and Cantonese could be a minority language here. And I could see that very well happening.
I'm very interested by your question. Unlike Keith traded up to become a journalism professor. I traded down to become a guy working in the food industry. So most of the people who I come across on a daily basis are working class Cantonese people. And I can tell you for a fact, among those people, very proudly Cantonese speaking people who have an attitude, a very big attitude towards mainlanders. And it comes up all the time. They say things like, that one's a mainlander. We hear that a lot. So there's this interesting dichotomy here between the political problem of mainlandization, which is Hong Kong becoming something less autonomous, less having the character that it did before, and what is frankly, you can't call it racial prejudice, but you could call it regional prejudice. Mind you, not unknown within the mainland itself. Talk to Shanghainese about people who live the other side of the Shanghai border. But, none of this is unknown, but I think it's very marked here. And I think it's really difficult to cover, because when you saw this in terms of political movements, you remember the protests against people coming over here buying powdered milk, which turned quite nasty. Part of that was political, part of it was sheer prejudice. So I think what is happening is that, in fact, the government, in the way that it's forcing Putonghua down people's throats, is forcing people to be more, to identify more closely with the mainland, is actually also fueling a rather nasty kind of prejudice. I think that's going to be a very big story. I don't think we've seen the end of that one.
It is part of a sort of global phenomenon, isn't it? It's sort of anti-immigrant. I was speaking to New Zealanders last night who were talking about the deep unease at the level of Chinese migration into New Zealand. And it's quite similar to how the issue is perceived in Hong Kong. It's rich Chinese buying property, so that's pricing you out of the market if you're a middle-class first-time buyer. It's clogging up doctors' waiting rooms, and it's sort of changing the fabric of society. But on a slightly more sort of hopeful note, I mean, just to speak from the slim experience of my office, the Economist has maybe 90 employees in Hong Kong, quite a lot are from the mainland, and quite a lot have committed themselves to being in Hong Kong and speak fluent Cantonese and are completely accepted. And this is, of course, something that's been going on for decades. I remember a couple of decades ago, was it a Maggie Cheung film in which she played a mainlander who really stood out when she arrived as a country bumpkin in Hong Kong, and she very quickly changed her hairstyle, learned to speak Cantonese and so forth. And so I think it sort of, does it not depend on, you know, what your commitment as a mainlander is to Hong Kong. But just a sort of corollary to that is the view of mainlanders to Hong Kong, which we've touched upon. And Steve talked about the sort of, you know, the groundswell of kind of good cheer for China mainlanders at the time of the handover. What has also changed is the way mainlanders think of Hong Kong people and of Hong Kong. And it was once a place to admire and to aspire to. And that sort of informed our argument that Hong Kong could change China. But because of Chinese people's experiences in Hong Kong, there's a sense of sort of ingratitude, which by the way, we get from the authorities as well. I mean, the foreign ministry, they sort of say, why isn't, you know, why are they so ungrateful? We're giving them all this autonomy. You know, why are they complaining, the ingrates?
Thank you. I would love to continue the conversation, but we're actually in overtime. I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers, Keith Richburg, Steve Vines, Dominic Ziegler. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.